I want to really congratulate you on your channel. I am seeing a lot for your channel. I think you've raised a couple of very, very good points. And I really like the look of your channel and the fact that it's integrating into a lot of facets when it comes to rational assisted dying, Maid, and also just the way that society views suicide and assisted dying. Like, and I think that this is without judging your further content. But you've raised a terminally ill problem, and you've also raised that your brother, and I'm so sorry to hear it, but your brother shot himself. Um, you'd actually think that most people would take your situation and will go into the opposite route, the former route of actually suicide prevention. And contrary to what's first believed, you actually took this as an opportunity to kind of skirmish a better way of assisted dying. So that's quite interesting because you'd actually think that someone with your situation and background losing a brother to suicide would actually use that to then prevent suicide. So that could also be used by a lot of suicide people. Like it's being used by this. You kind of know their own arguments because suicide prevention people always say, "Oh yeah, but for the people who survive suicides to their brothers and sisters and so on, these people go and prevent suicides." But you kind of prove those people blank slate because your situation is kind of to get people to a better means of ending this life without having to, let's say, shoot themselves or jumping off cliffs. So I do applaud you for that one because I do think that you really come out in the open to something that I've always fancied, and that was good rational arguments to get people to enlist their rights. Um, we are facing a lot of opposition. I mean, you can see it around the world. I mean, I live in South Africa, and just as I'm speaking, there was a recent uh, referendum going on in New Zealand, but there was also a recent application to the government, to the parliament, I think, for two suicidal people, two people who wanted to end their own lives, and they were both having refractory illnesses, terminal illnesses, and these people were claimed terminally ill by a pair of physicians. One was a physician, the other was a patient, and both of them did a formal request to the government for assistance and dying for a Maid request, and they were both denied the Maid request. Here in South Africa law, you can actually do a request to the government if you're terminally ill. And interesting said that these two people were terminally ill. They were both atheist, non-religious, and they have posited the request to the government. Even though they have fulfilled all the boxes, they were denied that right. The same thing can be said in all the other countries, not only the third world countries or the developing countries, but first developed countries like Canada, or, I mean, we did see it with the Adam Clayton case, how he was rejected even though he had made an absolute no-one's in wanting to die. He was being rejected. He was being followed by police people. He was being followed the whole time. I mean, if you look at Adam Clayton, it was actually scary to think he was a 27-year-old guy who had no life quality, and his whole government and his whole country literally rejected his right to die to the point where he had to import substances in. I don't even know what he imported, but apparently he imported that, and he died with he was just being pushed to fend his corner. Um, you raise a couple interesting things about being terminally ill and stuff, because the problem that we currently face, and you know it as well, is we're facing a pro-life society. It's almost like suicide or anything related to suicide is something that should be illicit. And I mean, the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the doctors and psychiatrists religiously use to diagnose people's torments and illnesses. Well, if you look at the DSM, and you can skim through it yourself and realize that whenever you see the word suicide, it is linked to a catastrophic schizophrenic or absurd condition, and never in the sense of rationality, to the point where a person can actually rationally or constructively decide on it. Anytime suicide is being listed in the DSM, it is almost always, it is always listed as a form of a mental retardation or a involuntary response to a bad situation, and never seen as a rational enactment. And that to me is almost like it's almost like a foolish endeavor on speaking to people who learn it. So that's got to change, because what you're seeing in the DSM with psychiatry and with doctors viewing suicide as always a disease, you're definitely seeing it in today's modern society, or even in the learned society. And that's really sad to me, is you look at doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists, and these medical professionals are kind of steered to the point where they view suicide or anything with relation to wanting to die or depression as negative, and they're stigmatizing it. They're strapping lids onto it and say, well, it's always bad to feel this way, and one should never die. It is thanks to suicide prevention groups and the pro-life groups like doctors and the parliament who says that suicide is always wrong and it's never rational. They create a false binomial, and they say basically that suicide is never rational under no condition. I think that this is creating unnecessarily roadblocks for themselves, because now comes the thing with rationality. You know it with your channel, but we're trying to fight, and I'm also part of the fight. I've actually been voting for the referendum in New Zealand. When I've lived there, I voted for the right to die, and unfortunately this right to die was only for terminally ill people. This is unfortunately the right to die law that's coming to pass around the world. It's like this new kid on the block. The right to die laws are all, without exception, only for terminally ill people, with one exception. Only Switzerland has the right to die as a constitutional law, which means that any rational person has the right to die and can approach a physician if they wish to enlist that right. That's the only country, I think with exception of 2 other countries, where it's strict criteria administered, where one can actually opt for the right to die. What's also quite interesting to me is how modern society thinks that the right to die enlisted will cause everyone to want to die. And this is simply absolute baloney, because if you look at Switzerland and all these other societies that's landlocking it, you're seeing the right to die laws being quite ferving, and at the same time people don't complain about suicides going wrong, or people committing suicide illicitly, or even people who shouldn't be committing suicide would kill themselves. So when when pro-life groups or suicide prevention groups like to tally the fact that suicide activism should never exist because people will die who shouldn't be dying, they aren't doing their homework, because when they're looking at the very countries, what they should be doing is looking at countries who have suicide as part of its parliament or enactment, and then see how these countries fare when it comes to people wanting to die, and if there are people who are dying who shouldn't. And you don't see this problem being raised by places like Switzerland. In Switzerland, there's a very strong, having assisted dying, there's also a very strong palliative care unit, and there's almost like no problem with hinging assisted suicide and palliative care together. In no example is a doctor telling a patient, for instance, that assisted dying is an option. That's something that the patient first-handedly come with to the doctor and say that he wants. So the objection to assisted rational dying to the disabled, and saying that just because assisted dying would be legal means that disabled people will now being, very, very intimidated by it, is almost fallaciously put, because looking at Switzerland as a great example, and other right to die countries, these assisted dying laws wouldn't be a problem that a doctor would posit to the patient and saying that they have an option to, obligation to. They would only posit palliative care, but should the patient then continually make a request, but the only thing that the assisted dying will help is that the doctor won't say no. So it isn't saying that the doctor will come up with the, the will posit this as the dying to the patient. That's not what but that's what the disabled groups or disability representatives say. So they say that if this is the dying is legal, then disabled people will be vulnerable to these laws because the doctors will tell them that they should kill themselves. But this is absolutely just preposterous because because the safeguards will exist to such a point where a doctor won't have to posit a law to a disabled person. It's just if a disabled person requested from their end that the doctor might have the option. So the right to die laws will go both ways. It will be beneficial in the sense where a patient requests it, that it won't be denied by the doctor, but it will also have the safeguards needed to make the law not pose a threat to people who, let's say, disabled or underaged or in a specific minority setting that shouldn't be having this option. So luckily for safeguards, and this is something that is almost like never talked about, is safeguards. But luckily safeguards, there's an unlimited safeguards that could be installed in making anything almost reasonably illicit or reasonably acceptable. And the same thing goes for the right to die. Not having safeguards shouldn't be a reason that people are abstaining from this argument. People can insert the safeguards that they think should be needed and even construct a debate. Now I'm thinking about, and what you're obviously taking is the absolute right to die as a legal constitutional right. And this is the thing that us groups have tried to debate verbatimly since the dawn of time. I mean, since I believe the 1950s and 1940s, people have even tried to start up debates with the governments. I mean, Australia has its own tally with 17 tries with different groups trying to push the referendum to the right to die, and this was only for terminal illnesses. This is to me very scary to think that you have these countries who are anti-religious countries or a-religious, quite atheistic countries, who are supposed to believe in humanism, but at the same time, when it comes to the right to die, these countries just turn a blind eye to these people, and it's almost like it's not even on the table to discuss. It's almost like you're born into this world, but the only right you ought not to have is the right to die. And it's almost like no matter how bad your life is, you have this obligation to live. And it's almost like it's never acceptable to want to die. This is kind of the way the world views it, and I do take the view that there's a hidden agenda going on. I don't think it's just coincidence. I think there's something hidden that goes on with people or the governments being this pro-life. It's either getting too much from people or it's just, in hindsight, very indifferent. And I think this ignorance problem with the governments and with the world leaders to the right to die, there's a bigger reason that people aren't allowed to die. I don't know if it's tax or is it an internal tariff or whatever it is, but to me, I'm just not naive enough to believe that the governments disallow people or disenfranchise people from dying just for the sake of their own rights. I think there's something behind the corner here. I think people are too valuable to these fuckers, and they want to keep them alive and feed them to pay tax and do all this shite, so that they can keep sitting on their fat butts in their golden chairs with crowns, and then hail the blues and they want to have the fun out of it, and having people, they don't really care about you or me. And I think that's just like the sense of incentive that these people are kind of tailoring for. And to me, I don't even think it's really about rights. I think rights are just the cornerstone, or the straw men or the steel men that these people are utilizing to dupe people and thinking that they're actually more important than they actually are. But that's like an argument from another standpoint. As far as the right to die goes, I think that it's pretty. I think that anyone doing their homework will find that the pro-lifers are full of shite. And I mean, any argument from I've never seen any good argument from a pro-lifer is not filled with ignorance. I don't think how you can construct a good argument for having no right to die, because the right to die is in fact a right. And you know, bombing or completely just jettisoning the right to die for the fact that it should never be elected is, to me, just ignorance. When you have a topic like the right to die and someone saying, well, this right should never be there because people will apparently kill themselves that shouldn't be dead, and it's almost like it's destroying, it's missing the map for the place. It's almost destroying the whole concept because of a disremark to the wrong people. And yes, the wrong people dying is not a reason to reject the right to die. The wrong people dying is sad, but it's not a reason to reject the right to die solely for the fact that wrong people will have access to it. So I do think logically we have done a very good role when it came to the right to die. I think logically we've done a very good thing. I think we got people like Philip Nitschke and people like Jack Kevorkian, and all these people have really made a very good dent in the world matters when it came to rationale about the ethics and morale of people wanting to choose to leave this earth. But I think there's a lot of other oppositions that's not always that rational, and I don't think that the biggest or the largest are rational oppositions. If you ask me, the biggest oppositions come from hidden mists of other reasons, of probably religious reasons, or people wanting other people around, or I don't think it's rationally induced. But I do think we have a very far way to go as well. And I do think what happens with rejecting people their rights is they're going, what we saw in the 1950s and the 60s and the 70s, we see students going against the mass of governments. They become freedom fighters, they become skirmish, they become the militias, they stand up against society and against societal rules. I think this will just continue happening, and with the right to die, I think the right to die actors will become aggressive at some point, and they will say fuck it all, and they will become literally moral freedom. That's what I think will happen. I think you're going to get younger people within the next generation who are going to stand up and even take up arms and say that they want to fight for the right to die. They're probably going to start to raid shops. They're going to probably start to raid pharmacies to get the drugs that they want, because they're going to get aggressive about this right that they're being denied. I think that's what's going to happen. I don't advocate for this at all. I'm a very lawful person, but I'm saying, just out of a perspective from my own, what's already happening in the world. When you reject people their rights, you're going to have you're going to create a bottleneck. Essentially, you're going to create people who are so extremely obtuse to the deafening ears that's being handed to them by governments and by the politicians. And then these people are going to they're not going to even be afraid to take up arms to get what they want in life. And essentially, when we keep turning a blind eye to rights and we call it unimportant, because I think this is what the society has done since yesteryear. Society has been doing this and telling it that the right to die isn't really that important. Let's just jot it off. We have to keep living. We just have to smile and wave at the rainbows and the stars and the sky and pretend everything is nice, and there's honey and fairies. And unfortunately, everyone's lives aren't clouded by the fairies and the unicorns. And unfortunately, the governments aren't really caring, because for them, their lives are pretty much damn well. It's the bottom dwellers who are suffering. But the governments don't care about the bottom dwellers, because the bottom dwellers are, they're last in line. And they also don't do anything good for the government or for the country's citizens. So let's say a homeless person don't do anything good to fuel the economy. So the government don't care about that person failing in life and just jumping off a cliff. That's fine to those people. And I don't even think suicide prevention groups care so much about those people. But they definitely target those people by their stupid laws when they're saying that, but they're using, let's say, 5-year-old children who's depressed and kill themselves as an example to how everyone should never have access to suicidal means. So I do think part of the government is fueled by misappropriation and bad redundancies. And we as suicide or rational thinkers use the rights model to understand ourselves and our world that we're living in. But the government isn't as skilled as us. But my question is, where are we gonna eventually head to? Because if the government's just turning their back on people like us, how are we going to elicit a better framework to work from to get us? Are we going to eventually fund people privately? Let's say go to Switzerland to have the deaths, to have a privatized death. Are we going to be able to at least get it legally so that we can get a kind of portal for people to move through, so that these people can at least go to a country where it is legal without even being exploited as such, and for a better, let's say, an echelon to a better existence. Because the question I've always had is how are we going to work together in a form of cohesion to better this law as to keep people away from suicide or assisted dying who should be away from it, and empower the people who should have it in a framework that will have them what they really want. How are we going to breach the two worlds in this regard? That's my question. And it's something that I find very difficult, because as soon as we are talking about this thing, people are asking questions, and it's almost like the questions are redundant. And the questions are so that it's misrequested, and it's almost like it is this impeached forming. And I think the Righttodie Society we have done a very good job by addressing the logic behind the Righttodie. I think when you look at Nitschke, and Chris Docker, all these people, they really did a very good job at addressing the rationale between the right to die and let's say the right not to die. They have really addressed the corner arguments, the 5 pillars of why it's important to have the right to die. But I think more's got to be done to know where to go further. And I'm not really sure where to go further at this point. There's been research into methods, but I think we're always going to be speared by the government, because we can't really act. I mean, how are we going to act when the government says that people can't assist in suicide? Let's say there's books being published about suicide methods, but the moment that you even start a topic, you are now guilty of charge if someone takes that advice and kill themselves. So lawfully, there's almost like no framework. And that's something I have to ask you. How are we going to approach this? How are we going to have an open discussion without being prosecuted for some ridiculous reasoning and being told that we have somehow responsibly contributed to someone's welfare of actually dying in regard to actually helping them not doing this? Because, I mean, suicide prevention groups don't have to worry a dime about what they've done is right or wrong. They know it's right. They're taking the official route of what governments want them to do. But if you take the other route, then all of a sudden you're now guilty as charged. And this is also something that's difficult for me to kind of... I'm just going to stop the video.